Chapter 10 Evidence for the Kushites 1. 6 reasons lead to the conclusion that troops dispatched by Egypt's Kushite dynasty forced the Assyrian withdrawal. Singly, none of these may be enough to persuade. Collectively, they are strong and coherent. Here's the first. For excellent reasons, all scholars concur that a certain proportion of biblical material that describes the event of 701 BC was conceived for theological purposes. As factual history, the specific part of the account is worthless. Scholars generally agree on the location of the suspect material within the 2 Kings version of the deliverance, which, as we saw in chapter 7, is the oldest and most historically valuable of the Bible's 3 renditions of the Assyrian invasion. This suspect material consists principally of a single chunk of text, 26 and a half verse in length. It was inserted like a wedge after the rest of the story had already been composed. If one simply omits this material and then reads a biblical text straight through, free of this bulky theological insertion, the vital role of the Kushite Egyptian forces becomes instantly clearer. The book of 2 Kings as a whole is the fruit of a long process stretching over more than one generation of composing, editing, and re-editing material derived from various sources, including, among others, oral tradition, and archival texts. The book is a patchwork. The specific passage in the book that describes Sennacherib's invasion, i.e. 2 Kings 18:13 to 19:37, reflects this large trend. For a casual reader, this segment may appear to be a unified story, yet, as we have seen, a large amount of the narrative's action appears to occur twice. In the 1880s, a German scholar, Bernard Stade, examined this curious structure and theorized that it was a result of different people writing different parts of the 2 Kings invasion narrative at different times. Stade's contention that the text contains not 2 but 3 parallel texts appears not to have been seriously challenged since 1912 and is not generally accepted. Although I am critical of many of these experts' opinions on this matter of collage-like structure, their arguments seem sturdy. Specialists identify these 3 pieces as text A, B, and B2. Account A is the shortest by far, consisting of only chapter 18, verse 13 to 16. This passage describes the tribute that Hezekiah had to give to Sennacherib after his withdrawal and explains how the Hebrew king had to strip much of the gold and treasure from Jerusalem's Temple of Solomon. Notes Brevard Childs, it is generally assumed that this account rests upon an archival source which preserved the material chiefly because of its concern with the temple and its treasury. The archives would have been the temples. Account B1 makes up 18:17 to 19:9a, that is, up to midway into verse 9. Account B1 suddenly resumes again at the very end of chapter 19, verse 36. Of the 3 accounts, B1 is the most interest to us. In their book, Mordecai Kogan and Hayim Tadmor reach this reasonable conclusion. B1 bears the markings of an authentic event close to the time of Sennacherib's invasion, inasmuch as a person's place, situations, and are vividly recalled. It would seem that B1 was composed under the impress of the events themselves. This may have been within roughly 50 years of 701. Estimates by most top-tier specialists are approximately the same. B2 is what interrupts B1. It is the wedge of text from chapter 19, verse 9b through chapter 19, verse 35, that disrupts the flow of the story. It would have been written after B1. Some experts add nuance to this view of 3 main divisions. They say that the overall story may possibly also contain subdivisions, short fragmentary passages that may have been added separately, but even these experts agree on the narrative's basic 3-piece structure. These subtleties need not distract us. Some specialists date B2 several generations after B1 to the Deuteronomistic period of the exile. If they are right, that would place B2 in the heart of the 6th century BC, with a minor part of it perhaps still later. One expert suggests that at least one fragment of B2 reflects thinking of the post-exile period. Generally, the more time that elapses between the event and the account of it, the less likely is the account's accuracy. This is one of the reasons of downgrading the credibility of B2 relative to that of B1. Another reason is that those who wrote B2 do more theological tinkering with the material than did those that wrote B1. The main point of B2 is that Yahweh will defeat those who dishonor him and will reward those who trust him. Says Childs of B2, the effort to picture Hezekiah as a type of faithful king that emerged out of as a dominant concern. Has emerged as a dominant concern. The understanding that there is a radical alteration of traditional material which serves a new function for the author should provide a warning against a simple-minded historical reading of the text. The B2 account introduces a story that runs somewhat parallel to the action of B1. It features a repeated blasphemous threat by Sennacherib to the besieged city. Hezekiah's repeated distress upon receiving the threat, his repeated visit to the temple, and repeated assurance that by Isaiah that Yahweh will defend the city and make the Assyrians withdraw. None of these repeated elements, however, is identical to its counterpart in B1. In B2, Assyria's blasphemy becomes more intense. Hezekiah visits the temple more confident that the Lord's role in saving Jerusalem was more direct. The setback of the Assyrian army more momentous. As Charles puts it, the B2 version reflects the author's strong theological concern to edify. Francolino Gonsalves cogently theorizes on the reason for the B2 revision. As with B1, upon which it depends, B2 uses as a point of departure the fact that Sennacherib did not destroy Jerusalem. As the B1 account presents it, however, the outcome of the events was too modest for the purposes of the B2 author, wanting to highlight the fact that Yahweh is the only God of all the earth. This author needed as a much more dramatic denouement. As well, he had to change the Assyrians' challenge to Yahweh into a blasphemy of the most shocking kind. Between the parallel accounts, here is by far the most important difference. In B2, the prophet Isaiah says Yahweh will make Sennacherib withdraw, chapter 19, 32 to 34. And then in the next verse, Yahweh does so as his angel slays the Assyrian soldiers. In B1, however, Isaiah says Yahweh will make Sennacherib withdraw by having him hear a report or rumor. Chapter 19, verse 7. Both terms are acceptable translations. Then 2 verses later, Sennacherib hears a report that Teharka, king of Cush, is approaching with an army to fight him. Once the B1 biblical narrative speaks of Teharka's approach in the tone of excited anticipation, what happens? An anticlimax. No sooner is Teharka introduced than B2 intrudes, changing the subject entirely. One moment Sennacherib hears the report that Teharka is threatening him, and in the next moment, according to the B2 insert, Sennacherib, apparently unruffled, sends the envoy to Jerusalem a second time to demand surrender. It's not until after the end of B2, more than 24 verses later, that Sennacherib withdraws from Judah. The casual relationship between the report of Teharka's approach and the Assyrians' withdrawal becomes harder to see. In standard editions of the Bible, more than a full page of double-column text intervenes. This makes it easy for a reader to interpret the retreat as a consequence of the angel's smiting of Assyrian forces. Clearly, to begin to understand what happened in 701 BC, one has to read the Second Kings by lifting out the entire B2 wedge and ignoring it. No modern scholar, to my knowledge, has explored this obvious solution in a serious, straightforward manner. This consistent failure to link the narrative flow of two parts separated by an artificial interruption is quite mystifying. The perplexing trend starts with the father of the collage theory himself, Stade. In his 1886 article, Stade proposes that the story be read in the obvious manner that has Isaiah's prophecy that Sennacherib would return home after hearing a report. Chapter 19, verse 7, is fulfilled 2 verses later when the king hears of Taharka's advance. But although Stade credits the report with causing the Assyrians to leave, chapter 19, verse 36 also asserts that the report misled them. The report, in other words, was false. Stade, who makes this surprising deduction without giving any reason, thus deprives the Kushites of credit for saving Jerusalem. Stade's hypothesis of a misinformed Sennacherib has fallen out of fashion, but among even the most eminent of the modern biblical analysts of the invasion, the tradition he founded overlooking the Kushite rule marches on. Childs, for one, notes that in passing, the close connection between chapter 19, verse 7 and chapter 19, verse 9 even observes that the prophecy of Isaiah had been fulfilled in the rumor, which caused Sennacherib's return. But then, instead of pausing to discuss that report/rumor, he veers away to pursue other matters. He responds to the whole question of Taharka's involvement by abruptly ending all discussion of it. Other specialists at least give reason for denying the Kushites credit, although they do so only in passing. It is only fair to present these views. Ronald Clements acknowledges the feasibility of linking the two parts of B1. When one makes the merger, he acknowledges the story requires no miraculous supernatural action on God's part, who simply causes Sennacherib to hear a report of a move by Tirhaka, which compelled him to depart from Judah without pressing his attack upon Jerusalem. He rejects such a reconstruction of events, not by means of critical examination of such a role by the Cushite-led army, but rather, he says, because of ample evidence of Hezekiah's timely surrender. As discussed in the previous chapter, evidence that for Clements is ample is for me invisible. Kogan and Tadmore devote a single sentence to discussing the report on its own merits. They assert that Sennacherib's retreat is explained as caused by a rumor, may mean that the true nature of the report in chapter 19, verse 7, was either unknown or immaterial by the time of the storytelling. Kogan and Tadmore then go on to say, very plausibly, that the core of the B1 account originated, perhaps orally at first, within the first generation of Isaiah's disciples. The two ideas appear to be incompatible if the B1 narrative had been produced within a few decades, that is, within the first generation of the invasion. As appears likely, the actual cause of the besiegers' departure could hardly have been unknown to its authors. If the authors themselves had not experienced the siege, plenty of survivors of the invasion would have been around to tell them what happened. It thus seems quite strange that the cause of their kingdom's survival would either have been unknown to them or deemed by them to be so unimportant or immaterial as to not be worth mentioning. The writers would either have had to be incurious in the extreme, or simply obtuse. Consalves's reasoning is more involved. He acknowledges candidly, concretely, the content of that report in Taharka's entry into the war. He even says that Second Kings presents a casual relationship between Taharka's arrival and Sennacherib's departure, yet Consalves insists that this can have no historical basis. Rather, he suggests this business about Taharka's arriving and Sennacherib scrambling away is literary invention. Its purpose, he proposes, is to reflect a theological concern by casting Taharka representing Egypt as causing the Assyrians' abject departure. The Second Kings writer is trying to underscore the extent of the arrogant invaders' humiliation. After all, via Rabshakeh, the Assyrians had earlier mocked this same Egypt. Such reasoning by so serious a scholar leaves me flabbergasted. He rejects the possibility that Taharqa would have really repelled Sennacherib for the simple reason that Second Kings writer has drawn a theological lesson from such a deed. In other words, if an event lends itself to a didactic storytelling, it cannot have taken place. Following this logic, Cyrus the Great's conquest of Babylon and his emancipation of the Hebrews never took place, for the reason that the Bible draws lessons from these events. Other rationales for denying Taharqa's denouement are also in circulation, and they are no more reasonable. Denying Taharqa's involvement in the outcome then takes real effort. Seeing such involvement, however, requires no strain at all. And all one has to do is connect the two parts of B1, omitting the problematic wedge. Here, without the insertion of B2 in the way is the way the narrative would read in the New International Version onward from 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 5. When King Hezekiah's officials came to Isaiah, bearing the message about the Rabshakeh's blasphemous call for surrender, Isaiah said to them, "Tell your master, this is what the Lord says. Do not be afraid of what you have heard. Those words with which the underlings of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Listen, I am going to put such a spirit in him that when he hears a certain report, he will return to his own country, and there I will have him cut down with the sword." When the field commander, the Rabshakeh, heard that the king of Assyria had left Lachish, he withdrew and found the king fighting against Libnah. Now Sennacherib received a report that Taharqa, the Kushite king, was marching out to fight against him. The B2 break occurs here. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there. Did the revisionists remove some B1 material at the break that originally explained what happened between the time of Taharqa's reported approach, and Sennacherib's exit? That is something we may never know. What we do know from this reconstructed text is that as the Kushite Egyptian forces advanced, the Assyrians withdrew. What could be clearer?